to the Chase series, and it's presented by Microsoft and Model Technology Solutions. If you missed part 1, we covered the updated features of Windows 10. So a lot of those things were around security. We did record that video as well, and so I know Jeff or I can provide you with a link to that video if you want to go back and watch it. To help level set some expectations for this session, the goal here is to provide an overview of how to manage Windows 10 as a service using some of the Microsoft tools. Now, these tools include things that are on-prem, such as System Center, and tools that are cloud-based, such as OMS and InTune. And the conversation around securing the workplace is that this is no longer a let's set up a firewall, install some antivirus, and we're good to go. It's more of an active posture in the workplace, and more so than it's ever been. And so, again, while in part 1 we talked about the features, in part 2 we want to get a little bit more into the technical side of the components and learn how to operationalize those updates to Windows 10. And it's going to be focused primarily on Windows 10 again because the client endpoint is such a wide attack surface, right? So you have users on these devices that are moving networks, that are in and out of public places in many cases. And so things like monthly updates or semi-annual updates can be much more important and all that much more challenging to somebody who's not in it day to day just yet. So there is no right or wrong way to do this. Every organization is quite a bit different, and finding what works for you is really the goal here. We should have plenty of time during our session today to ask questions at the end. You can also type them in the IM chat window, as I believe Jeff will be monitoring the IM chat window as we go along.
Yes, I will.
Excellent work, Jeff. So let's go ahead and take a look at the agenda. So we'll go through a brief introduction of who I am and who Model Technology Solutions, who we are. We'll take a look at Windows as a service. We'll take a look at operationalizing the deployments, as we just kind of spoke about. And then we'll look at the upgrade readiness and how do you determine if you're ready to upgrade. And then finally at the end we'll have time for questions and answers. So a little bit about Model. So we're a Microsoft Gold partner. We have 2 service lines. We have a consulting service line, which is a team of experts ready to identify, design, build, and operationalize technology, things such as OMS or EMS components, Azure IS, all the System Center components, Windows 10, Windows Server 2016, those kinds of things. Then we have a managed services division that serves as almost an extension of your team for managing things like PowerShell DSC or System Center, and they're backed by guaranteed SLAs and can offload issues onto our team to help remediate them faster. In addition, things like patching or image servicing, things like that, pretty efficient at to help move your kind of organization along down the road. A little bit about me. So I'm the managing partner of Model Technology Solutions. This is my 16th, soon to be 17th year in professional IT. I've got a couple of children and a wife. I'm a CrossFit enthusiast, and it seems like forever ago, but I was the technical editor of the Mastering System Center Configuration 2007 R2 book. And more recently, I was a contributor on the Microsoft white paper, the Release Pipeline Model, that really talked about Windows as a service and more of an infrastructure as code DevOps piece, which if you haven't read the Release Pipeline Model, it's a riveting read and would encourage everybody to read it. So let's move on to why we're here today and talk about Windows as a service. Now, taking a look at what that actually means, it's important to get a base understanding of how security updates will work in Windows 10 so that you can properly manage it for your organization. So there's 2 primary kinds of updates that we can classify for Windows 10. There's the feature updates, which happen 2 to 3 times per year. What we're seeing is they're about 2 times a year, spring and fall. And so if you relate this to current versions of Windows 10, you have 1703, which was released in March of 2017. And then you have 1709, which was released in September of 2017. And so you can pretty much guarantee that there will be a spring and fall release of Windows. They may get a little bit out of sync as time goes on, but so far they're kind of on that track. Windows 10, just to overstate some of the obvious, it'll be the final edition of Windows, or so we're told. So there'll just continually be updates to Windows 10. So there used to be things like Windows XP, Windows Vista, etc., Windows 7. Those things will not exist anymore. It'll all be Windows 10 with different flavors, and the flavors would be things like the build date or the release number, so 1703, 1709, the month and the year. And then you have the monthly or cumulative quality updates, which is probably more in line with what everybody's really familiar with. The once per month hotfixes. In Windows 10, the hotfixes are all inclusive, so if a PC is offline for an extended period of time, you should only need to install the one update, and you should be up and operational to the latest build. And so it's important to understand the two designations here. And the feature updates we're going to spend a lot more time on, but the feature updates are incredibly important because they change the operating system, they change the features in the operating system, they might impact application usage. And so you're thinking to yourself, well, we'll just stay on our current version for an extended period of time. Maybe like we did with Windows XP in those days, or Windows 7 in those days. And we're going to go through next why that's not necessarily, why it's not possible. And so if we look at the release cycle, I try to bring this up whenever I can so that people have the information. So if you've heard it already, it's never a bad thing to have a refresher on it. But there's a timeline for how long Windows 10 will be valid. And so if you were to put a cap on it, think in terms of 18 months. So the total duration of support is about 18 months from start to finish. And so there's some general guidance on this, but what that really means is that once you hit the end of a life cycle, and so I think they just stopped supporting 15.11 here in November. So we've released in November of 2015. I don't believe you're able to get security patches for that operating system any longer, and that is going to be the cadence moving forward. So once you hit roughly about that 18-month mark, your operating system will not get patches any longer, and so want to make sure everybody's aware of that. So it's not you can't take the stance of I'm going to deploy Windows 7 and then as soon as the machine is returned back in or off lease 2 or 3 years later, that's when they'll get a new operating system or the latest updates. That's not a good kind of, I guess, approach to it because you won't have patches for some period of time in that window. Okay, it's more of a continuous release cycle, and so there's always going to be at least 2 releases that are supported at once. So when one release goes into a broad release, then you'll see something kind of start into the 60-day window to where they'll start deprecating. So if you see here the spring release and pilot, the spring release from a year ago will start end-of-lifing there pretty quick thereafter. So theoretically, you would be able to skip a release, either fall or spring, if you're current and up-to-date. But really, the bigger thing here is, and one of the big pieces of this presentation, is making sure that everybody's aware that there's a lot of work to operationalize this in an organization so that the proper testing and the proper cadence is followed for this. But if you think about this, that what used to deploy an operating system in a once a year or once every other year project where there's a big undertaking, now has to be done once a year or once every year and a half. And so that timeline is shortened, and it needs to become more operational, less of a project. So let's take a look at how we operationalize that deployment to make the transition from a larger ongoing project into something a little more palatable that is managed by your team. And so this is a good infographic that in the olden days, the early 2000s, there was a lot of long planning phases and even a longer deployment cycle many times. And in this case, over the last 17 years of desktop deployment, they're suggesting that the amount of effort that it takes is going to shrink significantly. And using some of the modern tools, some of the things I touched on in presentation 1, you can certainly get to this end state where it's less intrusive on IT to keep things up to date and to manage. So the idea is that you become more nimble as time goes on and it's less customization. Now, this is one view of the effort. Again, it may or may not be right for your organization. There's probably a combination of modern approach and kind of a legacy approach that will need to take place in many organizations. At least that's what our experience is starting to prove out to us. So a couple of things in this that we can't lose sight of as you start going down the operational phase is that communication plans about the upgrade will make a significant impact. Updating the tools that surround Windows 10, like group policies and SCCM if you're a traditional on-prem piece, are important. And then a lot of application testing needs to happen through the upgrade and update process of those feature releases. And so how we get there, this is pulled from Microsoft documentation. It kind of serves as general guidelines for how to approach the different deployment groups as it pertains to feature and quality updates, right? So if you were to look at it from a high level, you have test, pilot, production is the gist of it. But the nice thing is here, they have some more defined days around how those things are aimed, right? So you have broadened production, usually is 120 days out from release. So, once it gets released, you're 1 to 3 months, somewhere in there, from providing the feature updates to the masses, right? And again, these dates are simply recommendations, but you gotta have to start somewhere when you start operationalizing this technology. Ideally, as soon as it's released, you have somebody in preview and test, and it's usually somebody in IT. It's a few machines to evaluate early builds, to understand the new features in the builds, to maybe update the tooling around those builds. And then you go into what's called a targeted pilot. And so these are devices across various teams in your organization that maybe make up a good sampling of what your organization looks like from the general population. And we tend to, approach this as people that are friendly in IT that can give you really good feedback to the organization of if things are working the way that they should be or not, right? Then you go into broad production release, which is kind of the rest of the organization. And then you have anybody that has not been updated yet needs to be handled on a critical basis. And so when we take a look at that can be something difficult to really break down into into something palatable. So a simpler way to interpret it, at least in my opinion, is you deploy to the most adaptable users first and to the least adaptable users next. Right, so it's similar to the deployment groups that were constructed for major upgrades or deployments. Just kind of a different way to think about it, and it's a way to separate machines during deployments over a timeline. Now you don't have to do that, right? Again, there's no right or wrong way to do it, but whenever you introduce technology into your organization, it's always been my recommendation to pilot, get to a bigger group, and then go out to the masses that way. You just ensure less things will break, ensure less downtime if there is an issue as kind of time goes on. And again, keep in mind that all of these things need to happen now once a year. So defining these standards that we're going through and we're talking about is an important step in the process, right? So here's some examples. So that early test group, those early preview builds, IT admins, they can learn those new feature sets, determine applicability, update the ADMX files for group policy, and set the settings are applicable. Because you have to think in terms that as Windows 10 comes out, new features, security features, things like that are going to be added into the operating system. You not only have to understand what those features are, but you have to control them in your organization if you're a traditional on-prem organization. I'll talk a little bit about a cloud-only organization, and we have a fair amount of experience with this because we're moving ourselves to a cloud-only organization and getting rid of all of our on-prem, and we're about 80% of the way through it. So getting to the state is achievable, and we'll cover some of that a little bit later. For a pilot group 1, you want to kind of look at your application testers and maybe some friendly folks in IT. For pilot group 2, and then you get that application sign-off prior to production rollout, right? I cannot iterate enough that once your applications are tested and managed well, the rollout will go much more smoothly. If you were to just deploy feature updates on top of Windows, you'll probably have a high success rate that Windows will work, but then you have all the applications underneath that you'll have to manage or worry about if they're not necessarily done in a modern approach, if they're more of a traditional installation. And so how do you handle and manage those applications is another piece we're going to talk about here in a few minutes. And that really ties into the OMS conversation. So to get into the production group 1 and 2, so the most adaptable users to the least adaptable users. Now that's one approach to it, right? So this is something that, again, is an ongoing operationalizing task that you have to make in your environment that may not exist today. So a lot of this might happen during projects in the past that needs to happen more frequently. So along the same timelines, there's another way that you can kind of look at it, right? If you think about it in terms of self-service and maybe not breaking the production group up as finely as we did in the last example. So you've gone through, you've updated all the ancillary components, you've got application sign-off, the IT-friendly folks are all on board. Maybe now you just push it to the production group of users. And so in this approach, it's much more like our phones. And so if you think about your phones, when your phone has an update, you get a red bubble or a notification, and you simply update it at your convenience. Well, the same thing can happen in Windows 10, even if it's a corporate managed device. And so as we go down the path of having users that are more that are used to self-service, this is something that you can provide, whether it's through InTune or SCCM or even some of the group policy pieces. So as you get into this state, it's likely going to head down this path, kind of down the road in the future, just given the consumerization of IT that's happened over the last 5 or 6 years, right? So something to think about as you go into Windows 10 if you want to implement this kind of from the get-go. All right, so some servicing tools. So if we take a look to how do we accomplish the tactical work, there's a set of tools here. There's Windows Update for Business, which is basically allowing you to defer the quality or feature updates according to the company policy. There's WSOS, SCCM, InTune, OMS. There's a bunch of different tools that help you kind of go through this. We're going to go through a lot of them in the demo, and so I'm going to try to get us to the demo a little faster and get through some of these slides. Right? So just some things to be aware of as you go through the tools comparison. Some of the basic tools give you very rudimentary options for delivery, whereas some of the larger tools such as SCCM give you a lot more controls and dials of how Windows is updated and managed in your environment. So really, again, this comes down to the need of your organization to understand, do I need some basics or do I need to be a little more cautious of how I control what happens to what users, right? And so we'll try to go through that when we get to the demo as well. We're almost to the demo, I promise. So far we've explained what Windows as a Service means. It's continuous deployment. You get 2 to 3 releases per year, right? We've talked about how to operationalize that in your organization. We've briefly mentioned some of the tools because I want to get to those in the demo. But one of the pieces of the tools that I really want to kind of mention here is the OMS Upgrade Analytics, which we're going to take a look at in the demo. But the solution integrates with SCCM. Really, this is where the information is configured to send the telemetry data to your private OMS instance. It's a simple breakdown in the console, but it's a really great tool outside of this for managing applications, and that's really what we're going to take a deeper dive into, is looking at how do we know if applications are ready, and where do we mark that, and how do we track it? Because if I'm updating machines once every 18 months, I have to have some way to continually manage and update what applications are critical in my organization, what applications are viable through an upgrade, which ones need to be reinstalled, so on and so forth. And so the OMS solution can help out with a significant part of those. And so we're going to go through some of that on how to get there during the demo. All right. So time to demo. Let me see here. All right. Oh, my bullets are out of order. So the things we're going to go through in the demo, we're going to go through the OMS portal for the upgrade readiness. We're going to go through InTune and look at how you manage update rings in InTune and we'll actually look at that on model production since we're almost cloud only now. We'll go through SCCM and we'll look at the servicing node. We'll take a look at the dashboard, set up a servicing plan, and then the task sequence. All right, let's see here. All right, so let's start. Let me get my notes up here so I don't miss anything. All right, we're going to start with the OMS portion. And so, as I had stated, OMS is a great tool for the Windows upgrade analytics for the upgrade readiness for Windows 10, but it does so much more than just that. And so there's a lot of different features and capabilities that you can bring forth in OMS. So if you're looking at a monitoring tool, whether it's on-prem or cloud, the solutions within OMS are significantly advantageous. If you're a Microsoft shop, and if you have Linux boxes, a lot of this spans across multiple operating systems. A couple of things just to hit on, things like AD assessments, SQL assessments, those pieces alone are well worth the investment into OMS. And so I can keep scrolling over so you can get a look at it, but it's worth mentioning, right? So there's a lot of different pieces to OMS, and we're only going to touch on one very small piece of it today, pertaining to Windows 10 and the upgrade readiness. So here I've installed the upgrade readiness solution, which is no more than a click, and I've enabled it in demo mode so that I have a lot of data to kind of comb through to show you. If I were to show you our company's personal data, it wouldn't be nearly as exciting because there's not that many applications in there. So what we have here, we have total computers upgraded. Then we have some application pieces to it. So you can prioritize applications to keep a running list of which applications are important in your environment. And when you go into this, you can go into the solution and you'll see things like low install count. There's a significant number of low install count, but then there's also a not reviewed count, right? So then you can go through a high install count and see which applications are in your environment, right? One of the nice pieces about managing your applications here from an ongoing basis is it feeds data from other organizations as well, not necessarily any kind of personal data or identifiable data, but things like, are there fixes available for applications? So if we look here, the Checkpoint VPN, for example, has an issue that it needs to be reinstalled after upgrading. And so there's some guidance that says there's no action required for the upgrade to proceed. The application will work on the new OS, but it just must be reinstalled. Now, if you think about that and determining for your organization and all of the applications that exist in your organization, whether it needs to be reinstalled, whether it can survive during an upgrade, how important it is it, how many PCs is it installed on, this is a good way to kind of track that information in a place where you don't have to manage the infrastructure behind it, right? Again, OMS does so many more things than this, but it's really good for this piece of it. I could spend a lot of time in OMS, but I realized that from a time perspective, I only have about 15 or so minutes left, and I have a lot more demo to get through, so I'm going to go ahead and move on. Keep in mind, we should have time for questions at the end here. So the next piece I want to talk about is InTune. And so this is the model production InTune that we're looking at, that we're just starting to drive devices towards, right? So it's still relatively new. But one of the things that we're going to do is we're going to run through, if we wanted to publish the targeted feature releases to a certain group of devices via InTune, We're going to take a look at how to do that now. And so within InTune, you have this concept of groups. So I'm going to create a group. I'm going to call this Windows 10 Targeted Pilot Semi-Annual Release. And then description for the group, I'll just use the same thing. Membership type, I can make it a dynamic, but because this is a pilot group, I'm going to make it assigned and I'm going to give it some members. I add my Surface book into the group. I'm going to create the group. So now I have a group. So back in the InTune piece, I'm going to scroll down here to software updates. And so the nice thing is either having a cloud only or moving towards a cloud only in our case solution for managing the update rings to ensure that none of our office personnel get them too early and the applications don't work. We would create a Windows 10 update ring from here within InTune. So we'll call this Windows 10 Targeted Pilot Semi-Annual Release. And so I'll go into Configure. And then I'm going to go into Semi-Annual Targeted. I'm going to allow for product updates. I am not going to allow for drivers because in my case, I'm not going to test that thoroughly, so I certainly don't want to break anything unless it's worth breaking. We're going to auto-install. Active hours are from 8 to 5, so anything outside of those hours it should install. I'm going to allow a deferral of the quality updates for, probably 5 days. And then for the feature release days, I'll add for 30, right? So now I should be able to defer those for 30 days, the bigger releases, but the monthly patches I only have a 5-day deferral on. And so as I spoke about, right, as you get into the tooling and the tool sets, you have some features you're able to control, and as you need or require additional granularity in those features, you kind of have to go to different tooling and different tool sets. For our purposes, InTune's perfect for this. So we'll go to Assignments, and we'll assign to select a group. We'll select it, and we'll save it. Okay, so now I have deployed a Windows 10 update ring to my pilot group, and in my case is my machine. I have the ability to defer quality updates for 5 days and feature updates for 30, but after that it's going to need to install to make sure I'm on the latest upgrade branch. Now, there are a lot more things within InTune that you can integrate into, but again, in the spirit of trying to get through the demo and getting as much information out there as I can, let's go take a look at how to do this inside of SCCM. All right. So there's a lot of different components within SCCM that you can leverage to deploy or to update. There's things like under the Windows 10 servicing branch, there's servicing plans that you can create that deploy updates a little more like Windows Update would, using deployment rules and things like that. But we're going to take a look at using a task which is a bit more customized for the on-prem users. If you needed to do a lot of different components or checking or pre and post installation tasks, which are requirements that exist out there. And so we'll use the example here. We have a Windows 10 1703 Enterprise upgrade. The first step was to import the upgrade OS bits into the SCCM console. And so we have 1709 and we have 1703. Those are straight from the installation media, no customization required there. And once we have that, we can create a task sequence for the update. And you'll be shocked at how minimal this one is, but it allows you, if you're familiar with task sequences, It allows you the ability to do a lot of pre and post. So when you think of things like, I have to uninstall this app, and then I have to reinstall this app, or I have to do this before I can do that, just what we saw in the OMS version. Well, now let's start tying it together. And we start tying it together, we can make that task sequence happen in an automated fashion. Step one to making it in an automated fashion is to understand what needs to happen during the process to reduce the impact on your user community. And a lot of it revolves around applications. It's much less about, in this case, it's much less about the operating system and how to get it down. It's much more about compatibility in the applications. Now, Microsoft does state, and so far so good in my experience, that the idea behind the more frequent releases and the feature updates, the idea is that there's more compatibility as you go. Now, with that said, that doesn't necessarily mean that everything's going to work as expected, especially when you go from one operating system, such as maybe 1607 or 1603 to 1709, right? So as you go down that path, testing those is going to be very important, and making sure you have somewhere to track them, like in OMS, for example, is a great way to start. And then if you needed to do something a little more advanced inside of a task sequence to say, you could say pre-checks for upgrade. You could add a bunch of groups, check for application existence. If the applications are there, remove these pieces of it. But you can see just from some of the upgrade operating system options that you have already more options than what you've had before. So you can have all sorts of different things between staged content or driver packages, timeout periods, setup compatibility scans, things that you didn't necessarily see that were available in InTune. It doesn't make it a better solution, just makes it a different solution, right? You may not need all those bells and whistles for your organization. You might need all of them for your organization, right? Pretty straightforward from the SCCM perspective of it. And when you think about operationalizing Windows 10, upgrades are just one facet, one component of it, right? And so there's a whole conversation to be had around the modern Intune joined, Azure AD joined, kind of the model that we're going to internally, and making sure that devices, when they join your network, are pre-provisioned through Intune, they're auto-enrolled, they get conditional access, all of those pieces. And then there's a hybrid approach where you can manage both of them within SCCM and Intune. So again, you might be doing this in multiple locations depending on your organization. Other things that got just a few more minutes here before we're going to go to the Q&A piece of it. Just some of the other pieces of the servicing plans here, probably don't have enough time to go through in any kind of grave detail, but wanted to show some of these pieces. So, for example, it looks very much like a WSUS interface if you're familiar with that. And one of the things that I'll do here is I'll go through and add some criteria, which is nice from this console if you're familiar with SCCM. So we're going to add the required filter. We're going to say if it's greater than or equal to 1, just to see what kind of scans we have still sitting around in our organization. So we have 8 machines that can go to 1709. We have 1 that's not on 1703 that's applicable, right? So in SCCM, you can drill through those and kind of figure out which machines you need to target or create a collection and a query for those if you needed to handle it a more granular. Now, keep in mind, the goal moving forward is to be to try to be a little more self-servicing for the users and allow them to pick, but I realize that not every organization's mindset is necessarily there yet. So from this standpoint, if you are ready to download and deploy the update, you could do so, tie it to a servicing plan, which basically ties together the collection and the schedule just like you're probably used to, the download settings, user experience, all those pieces. And that provides the installation from SCCM. So from an SCCM perspective, there's 2 main ways to do it, from a task sequence or from a Windows 10 servicing plans. And then from the Intune perspective, you can deploy the software update, and there's also WSUS that you can do so as well. In any of those cases, I cannot stress enough how important it is to do the testing and the preliminary work to get you there, and then put it into a process, a business process for your organization, so that as you're going through these semi-annual releases, that you have something you're following kind of step by step, and it's very much the same every iteration of it. That's pretty good. So the goal is to get through it in about 40 minutes, so I'm right on track. So we'll go jump back into the presentation and open it up for questions and see if there's other things that I can answer, or if there's if someone wants to dive in a little deeper. Yes, sir.
There were a couple of questions that were in the IM window that I have been struggling to answer while you were doing your presentation. I don't know if you want to turn your attention to those. You may have answered the initial one in the conversation, but I want to back you to them. It's like Rick had one. To use the upgrade readiness, what is the node that must feed OMS?
Yeah, so in OMS, you enable the readiness solution, and what that gives you is it gives you a script to configure Windows 10 devices that you push out, and I'll show you what that looks like, Rick. It's, I believe, that's kind of strange that I can't go full screen there. Try this again. There we go. All right. So inside of SCCM, I believe that we have a readiness package. And I believe it's an actual batch file, which is fantastic. We're in 2018 almost. And so in that package, you have a batch file that configures your OMS workspace, or the options within Windows 10 to point to your OMS workspace. And you get this from your OMS workspace, and then it'll basically run some PowerShell commands to set it to the correct OMS workspace, and data will start coming in for the readiness. And I believe Jeff, you can tell me if I'm wrong, I believe that the OMS readiness is a free part of OMS.
Actually, I was just reading that. That is exactly right.
Yeah.
I was trying to answer Rick's question. I did see that, so I can send that link out.
Yeah. So that's a super swell feature for Microsoft to manage applications and readiness for free. There's again, it's only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to OMS of what you can do with it. But it is well worth free by far for this solution. Do you have detailed steps for the entire SCCM discussion that can be sent out? Probably we can. I mean, it is literally, and I'm not trying to shortchange you, it is literally as easy from a technical or a tactical perspective as right-click, bring in the operating system. And when you bring in the operating system, you point it at the ISO bits that you would download from your volume license. And then you create a new task sequence. And one of the options when you create is an upgrade an operating system. And it asks you very few questions. Where's your upgrade package? You point to what you just imported. You add the index that you're going to deploy, because if you have a multi-indexed version, in the product key. If you want to install updates as part of the task sequence, and then you get what I showed you. So it is very basic. With that said, it actually runs and will upgrade your OS. And the delivery, I think I stated this, but the delivery of it is not necessarily as difficult as it is the being ready for the delivery and getting your processes down prior to delivery, right? Because you can certainly create that task sequence and push out in a matter of minutes. But making sure the applications work, what the experience is, what users are going to expect, being well communicated out, that's kind of the bigger step of it. You bet. And Chris, if you have any questions about that, feel free to just shoot me an email. I can help guide you through the tactical pieces of that. Do we need these Win 10 servicing plans in place before we go to Windows 10? Not necessarily. So good question, Rick. Windows 10, as you probably aware, if you're pushing out 1703 or 1709, you have 18 months from release, and that's a rough thumb in the air kind of estimate, right? So you have 18 months or so to figure out your deployment readiness plans, but it will creep up pretty quickly. And so when you get to the point of deploying Windows 10, the operational piece of it needs to follow very quickly. And it'll probably look very similar to what the old operating system projects looked like in your organization, where it's a little bit more lengthy, had a lot of user acceptance testing, a lot of piloting, but you'll eventually need to shrink that down from a timeline perspective because it will consume a significant amount of an engineer or two's time. And so, that's one of the things that we offer in our managed services, is to help bridge that gap from a tactical perspective, because there's plenty of business analytics that need to happen on the inside, and there's tactical pieces that need to happen on the SCCM, readiness, piloting side pieces of it. So always happy to help out on that side of the house too. Any other questions for me? So I think the next conversation that we're having on the Cut to the Chase is going to be pretty exciting. It's going to be the Windows Defender ATP, and that's going to be a presentation and a demo of the ATP interface and how to track threats in your organization, how to link it, how to watch it jump from computer to computer if you need that data. And so it's some really cool stuff inside of part 3 of this webinar series, securing the modern workplace. And just as a precursor to now, I'm sure some of you have heard me say this before, but the days of installing antivirus and hoping you get updated before you get infected is long gone. So taking a more active approach through something like Defender ATP and having notifications of suspicious behavior, maybe suspicious PowerShell commands that are ran on your machine, being notified about those things and being able to take action on those things and kind of shut a machine down, that's a whole nother level of management in your organization that can really help combat being owned in today's world. And so, I know personally as us as an organization for Model, we strive every day to make sure that we don't get owned. So adding more layers to the security posture is something that's important. Is there additional in addition to ATP? So really it's about the ATP portal and all the components that go there, the management, the settings, Rick. We'll walk through how to enroll into the portal and push out clients, and we'll go through some of the technical pieces of it as well as some of the more high-level business pieces. So should be a good combination of both. Oh yeah, so it's advanced threat analytics. Yeah, so the I've always heard it referred to as Defender ATP. What's that?
No, you go ahead. I was just going to say what you're going to say.
Yeah, so it's advanced threat analytics. I thought it was rebranded as just ATP now, isn't it?
Advanced threat protection. Yes.
Yeah. So that's a service that I believe is part of an E5 license that you can light up and take for a test drive. But I defer all licensing questions to Jeff.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I mean, and there are some a la carte options that are available. Depends on what you currently have as your base Office 365 SKU. But if you have specific questions for specific customers, happy to address those and provide you with pricing if you would prefer.
Yep.
All right.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone. And if you need anything, let me know. My email address is on the screen, and this is being recorded, so you can reach out to Jeff or I if you want to get the recording of it. If you need anything else.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Jason. Great job as usual. Folks, we'll probably pick this up again right at the beginning of the new year is our plan for number 3. If you have other suggestions after we get done with this 4-part series with Jason, we continue these kind of technical training offers for our customer base here in the Midwest. If you have subject matter that you'd like us to cover on the next one, we can absolutely bring those on. We bring great partners like Jason on to help educate you guys all the time, and always looking for ideas. We think this is a really strong series, but as everybody knows on the call, Microsoft sells quite a bit of different solutions. So happy to go into any and all of them with you. Just looking for feedback on what you'd like to hear about. So thanks very much. I'll send out this recording to anyone that sends me an email and requests it or puts an IM in the window. And we will plan on talking to you again sometime at the beginning of the new year. Thanks, Jason. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.